You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 21st of April 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Cermak. On today's programme, a look back at the life and legacy of Pope Francis. We'll speak with the former Vatican correspondent Juliet Linley and also with our very own Fernando Augusto Pacheco, because Pope Francis was, of course, the first Pope from Latin America.
Yes, indeed, Chris. Today we look at Pope Francis, or Papa Francisco's legacy in the most Catholic region in the world.
Thank you very much, Fernando. After that,
people think that tariffs will have a negative effect on the country and also on themselves personally.
We'll hear from the researchers of a survey about American attitudes to China, tariffs, and Russia. We'll also have a roundup of news out of the Nordic region. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Cermak. It is a day of mourning for the world's Catholics, and we will begin today's show with a look back at the life and legacy of Pope Francis, who was at 7:35 a.m. in Rome this morning, returned to the house of his father, as the Vatican put it in a statement. Pope Francis was 88 years old. Here is Monocle's Andrew Muller.
In the long history of the role he inhabited, Pope Francis was among the very few who got to have any kind of handover conversation with their predecessor. Francis ascended to the throne of St. Peter in 2013 following the resignation of Benedict XVI, only the third pope to stand down ahead of being recalled to barracks by the proprietor. If Benedict, then 86, had hoped to enable the passing of the papacy to a younger generation, he might have been disappointed by the conclave's choice. The white smoke billowed from the Sistine Chapel in honour of a man just 8 years his junior. Jorge Mario Bergoglio was born on December 17, 1936, in Buenos Aires, the son of Italian immigrants. He graduated from a technical secondary school with a diploma in chemistry and prior to finding his vocation worked in a food processing laboratory. After becoming a Jesuit novice, he studied in Chile and Argentina. He was ordained a priest in December 1969. Bergoglio's ascent through the Jesuit hierarchy occurred against a grim backdrop. In 1973, he was appointed Provincial of the Jesuits, effective leader of the order in Argentina. In 1976, Argentina's military seized power. The junta led by Lieutenant General Jorge Rafael Videla took a forbiddingly dim view of the social outreach conducted by some of Bergoglio's fellow Jesuits. Several priests and bishops were among the thousands of people who were tortured, murdered, or, as the gruesome euphemism had it, disappeared during the dictatorship. Some years after democracy was restored in 2000, Argentina's Catholic Church would apologize for its failure to confront the generals, a failure in which, some had it, Bergoglio was complicit, though no evidence was found that would have justified a formal investigation into his activity during this period. In 1992, Bergoglio was appointed an auxiliary bishop of Buenos Aires and in 1998, Archbishop of the city. It was in this role that he established himself as a maverick. His modesty and asceticism baffled conservatives. He rejected the official residence for a downtown apartment and ditched his chauffeur for the bus. His hardcore traditionalism enraged liberals, notably in his attempts to hold the church's line against the advent of same-sex marriage. He was, during this period, an outspoken advocate for the poor and a critic of any policy which promoted or permitted, as he saw it, inequality, a message which found an audience at a time when Argentina's economy was foundering. Pope John Paul II created Bergoglio a cardinal in 2001 and, as some saw it, implicitly anointed a successor with a similar combination of compassion for the poor and theological rigour. Bergoglio participated in the conclave which followed John Paul's death in 2005, but the cardinals plumped for the austere figure of Joseph Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI, though only, according to some later reports, after Bergoglio pleaded with some of his own supporters to abandon their campaign so as to ensure a quick succession. It was no great surprise to anyone that Benedict's papacy was short. He was 78 when he was elected. It was a tremendous shock to everyone that he renounced the role voluntarily. Benedict was a doctrinaire hardliner and a supremely unlikely convention flouter. Possibly encouraged by this anarchic outburst, the consequent conclave endorsed Bergoglio as the first Jesuit pope and the first from the Southern Hemisphere. He chose the name Francis after the eponymous saint. Francis signalled from the off that he intended to cut a less ostentatious dash than his predecessors. He abjured much of the ceremonial dress which attends the papacy and preferred the Vatican's guest house to the papal residence in the Apostolic Palace. As Pope, Francis not only seemed more relaxed on some matters than Benedict, which would not have been hard, but more so than himself of years previously. While the church he led remained dogmatically boneheaded on the subject of homosexuality, his famous remark, "Who am I to judge?" was at least forgiving, even if that in itself implied that there is anything to forgive on this front. It may have been that Francis understood that it might be in the Church's interests to give the prurient moralising a rest, as the scale of institutional child abuse it had long covered up grew clearer. Francis convened a summit and revised canon law to address these monstrosities, but always amid a justifiable clamour for more to be done, and sooner. Francis was a vigorous and enterprising diplomat. He was credited by Cuba for finessing its restoration of relations with the United States, and in 2021 undertook the first papal visit to Iraq, which included a meeting with Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani in the holy Shia city of Najaf. Francis will likely be recalled as a modernizer and reformer, but these things are relative. The Catholic Church remains officially as rigid on such subjects as homosexuality, abortion, and the ordination of women as it was when Jorge Bergoglio took his priestly vows. Pope Francis understood, however, that even, perhaps especially, within such rigid frameworks, conduct and character count for a lot.
Thank you very much, Andrew Muller. And joining us now for more on the Pope's passing is the journalist, broadcaster and former Vatican correspondent, Juliet Linley. And Juliet, as a former Vatican correspondent, let's start with your reactions and reflections.
Chris, it's not as if we weren't prepared for a papal passing. He had been hospitalized in February. He had 2 close brushes with death in the 38 days that he was in hospital. But this morning, it caught us all by surprise. You know, on March 23rd, when he left hospital, the world had been told he'd have to rest for 2 months. Don't expect to see the Pope for the next 8 weeks. He needs to do therapies for his mobility, his voice, for his breathing. That's what we were told. But Francis himself had always said, you don't need legs to run the church, you need a head. And he kept showing his presence even when he was supposed to be convalescing. So he confounded all of us, Chris, by popping up unexpectedly over the last week, which is, as you know, the most important week in Christianity. It's the Holy Week. And he popped up on several occasions, formal and informal, including yesterday, the most important day of the Christian calendar, Christ's resurrection, Easter Sunday. He was wheeled out onto the balcony at St. Peter's Square. He gave the traditional Urbi et Orbi blessing. And once he had done the blessing, he even had a zip around in his Pope mobile to bless the multitudes of pilgrims that had gathered. Chris, this is a holy year. It's a Jubilee year. So there are even more pilgrims flocking to Rome than you usually would have. And there were an estimated 50,000 of them yesterday in Piazza San Pietro and surroundings to see the Pope. So while his health was, poorly and he came close to dying, this was all of a sudden unexpected this morning.
And Juliet, as you mentioned, his surprise appearance in a way yesterday, his message on Easter Sunday was quite political in nature. It was appealing for peace and an end to conflict, a prayer for peace, which is part of his legacy. He was modest when it comes to economically, pleaded for inequality, confronting inequality, did not shy away from politics and controversial social issues, did he?
No, he didn't. And so in his blessing and in his message yesterday, he kept reminding people of the suffering in Ukraine, Palestine, Israel, Sudan, South Sudan, and so many other conflict zones. True to his papacy, he appealed to politicians, he appealed to those in positions of power to just help the needy, help the hungry, promote peace. That is what his papacy has very much been about. And he's always been about defending the less fortunate of society, those on what he calls the peripheries. And remember that he himself called himself a pope from the peripheries because he was the first pope from South America, so far away from Europe where all other popes had hailed from until then.
And world tributes have been pouring in for Pope Francis. And as it happened when you mentioned his conversations and appeals to world leaders, J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, was the last leader or vice president to meet him. They held a private meeting yesterday. What do we know of what they spoke about?
That was so unexpected, Chris, because nobody knew whether he was or he wasn't going to meet the Pope, but he did meet on the Saturday, so the day before Easter Sunday. He did meet the Pope's number 2, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, and the foreign minister, Archbishop Paul Gallagher, and they had discussions about their very diverging views on, if you want, migration and immigration. And there had been talk about whether J.D. Vance would or would not get a photo opportunity with the Pope that many thought that he very much craved. And then he got it, which was quite incredible, especially because he was the last leader that the Pope met before he passed away today. But it was such a telling meeting, if you want, because this is America's first ever Republican Catholic vice president. He's one of the highest profile converts. He only converted in 2019. He's only been a Catholic for 6 years. J.D. Vance himself called himself a baby Catholic. He's been having a tough time reconciling Washington's policies, those of Trump, with those of his church. So getting to meet the Pope on the day before he died is so poignant. And as you know, Chris, U.S.-Vatican tensions have been running so high as both Trump and Francis, I mean, they both are very much focusing on refugees and migrants, but on polar opposite ends of the spectrum. You know, Francis had always begged the world's leaders to have mercy on them, to welcome them, and Trump deports and dismisses them.
And Juliet, you speak of U.S.-Vatican tensions. There were also tensions within the Vatican at various points during Francis's papacy. Tell us a little more about those. I guess I wonder to what extent his legacy will have made an imprint in how Rome functions, how the Vatican functions itself.
He leaves an enormous legacy. He's created a lot of change in so many things that he's said, being so perceived as so liberal, if you want. He was at loggerheads with very conservative Catholics, especially American conservative Catholics, who viewed him as far too free and liberal. But, you know, he came to the papacy in 2013 on a mandate to reform Vatican bureaucracy and finances. But then he went so much further, shaking up the church and making so many changes, although he did not change the essence of the church's doctrine. So he approved church blessings for gay couples. He welcomed LGBTQ plus gays into the fold, if you want, saying, "Who am I to judge homosexuals?" He declared the church to be against capital punishment. He called on the possession of nuclear weapons to be deemed immoral. He also, interestingly, he met the Russian Patriarch Kirill in Cuba. That was a breakthrough in ecumenical terms. And he was a great proponent of interfaith dialogue. He met often with leaders of the Muslim world, with leaders of the Jewish world, as well as different factions within the Christian world. And he reaffirmed, however, a lot of things that people had been hoping that he would change. For instance, he still said that women could not be priests, Chris. He also upheld the church's opposition to abortion. Even though he seemed to have a softening towards women who had had abortions, he did not absolutely come out and say that he was pro-choice, not in the least. And he also, if you want to look at the upside, he added women to important roles at the Vatican. But most of all, he promoted dialogue with the poor. He met prisoners, he met migrants, as we said. And as Camerlengo Kevin Farrell, whom we will touch upon right away, because what is the Camerlengo and what is his role right now? As Kevin Farrell, the Irish cardinal, put it, it was about embracing all people, extending the arms of the church to everybody.
Absolutely. I have to say, Juliet, I once saw the Pope speak myself in Washington, D.C. and was struck by the way he spoke there about also praying for non-believers, which is such a sign of kind of how different he was from popes of the past. But finally, Juliet, as you do mention there, the Camerlengo, just remind everyone, perhaps, because it has been a little while, what happens now? What does the process look like?
It's interesting, Chris, because this is going to be the first papal funeral since 2005 when Pope John Paul II died, because Pope Ratzinger was the next pope. But as you might remember, he resigned. He did not die in office. Therefore, when he was buried, it was not a papal funeral. So the Camerlengo is the person who takes over in this period when there is no pope, a period known as the sede vacante in Latin. And it's Cardinal Kevin Farrell, as we said, an Irishman. And it's a critical role that he plays. And he oversees the administration of the Holy See, and he prepares for the funeral. That funeral will traditionally take place within 9 days of a pontiff's death. It's a period known as the Nomen Dialis. Sometimes funerals have taken place within 4 to 5 days. And then, this being a very pragmatic pope, Chris, Francis, just before the end of last year, so just a few months ago, he approved a new simplified rite for his own funeral. There were a lot of changes, including a simpler coffin, not elevating his body when it lies in state in St. Peter's, and possibly being buried not inside the Vatican, as most popes have been, but at his favorite basilica in St. Mary Major. That is absolutely not confirmed yet. There will be more statements coming out of the Vatican as the days go on. But these are changes that are a strong sign of, as we said, the Pope's commitment to humility, of his vision of the church being closer to the people, and how he saw himself as a shepherd rather than, let's say, a figure of worldly power.
Ever the modest Pope Francis. Juliet Linley, thank you very much for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. It is coming up on 12:17 here in London. And joining me now for the view of the Pope's passing from Latin America is our senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Fernando, Pope Francis was the first non-European pope in over a millennium, first Latin American pope. And so the reactions there as people wake up today will no doubt be particularly emotional.
Very emotional, Chris. And of course, to be the first Latin America in a heavily Catholic continent. In the Americas itself, I think it's 47% of the world's Catholic. So if you look at a country like Brazil, where I'm from, is the country with the highest number of Catholics in the world as well. Pope Francis was very much respected. Of course, as any previous popes as well, to be honest. But I think being Latin America, and as Juliet was saying, the care he was given to the poorest and the neediest in society, because he was also the first Jesuit to become a pope, which they are usually a little bit more socially caring among the factions in the church. He will be very much missed. And it's interesting, I was looking at the front pages this morning. He was on the cover of that, not talking about the death because of the time issues. He'll be on tomorrow's front pages. But, it was a picture of him during the Easter Sunday Mass and saying that, there was a surprise that he was actually there. So it's quite interesting. That shows the importance of him in the continent.
Absolutely. And Fernando, we were speaking just before this about the places he had visited, and it was quite striking. Then Latin America, given the fact that he is the first Latin American pope, he visited many times, many different countries. One, though, that he did not visit during his papacy was his home country of Argentina.
It's very surprising for some because, let's be honest, Papa Francisco is very much an Argentinian. He loves his tango. He loves football. In fact, he loves doing football jokes all the time. He had this kind of sense of humor that some people might not know about. But yes, he never visited Argentina. And, I was reading about it. I think there was a fear, probably from his side, to be used as a political tool. Because during the period of his papacy, Argentina had left-wing governments with Nestor Kirchner, Cristina, right wing, of course, with Javier Milei. So I don't think he had a good relationship with either. Not necessarily a bad one, but I would say frosty. So even Javier Milei, of course, he already says, a fellow man died as well, the Pope. We have our differences, but of course he'll be sadly missed. But there was this kind of feeling about him because he did visit Latin America. He went to Colombia, he went to Brazil, he went to Cuba as well, as Juliet was saying. But yeah, it's very, very interesting that being Argentinian, maybe if he had a few more years of life, I wonder if he would ever be visiting his own country.
And Fernando, as you say there, he did visit your home country of Brazil. And as I was saying to Juliet, I still remember when he visited the US and came to Washington, D.C. when I was there. It was a surprisingly emotional thing to see Pope Francis, in that case, in front of the Capitol. What do you remember of his trip to Brazil?
I mean, it was a big deal, that trip. It was back in 2013, his first international trip. It was World Youth Day in Rio de Janeiro. And I think he spent a week in Brazil. And I remember there was a massive event at Copacabana Beach. And I think it attracted over 3 million people in the streets. So he was treated very much like a rock star. And I have to say, that was his only visit to Brazil as well. And at the time, he gave a speech together with our president at the time, Dilma Rousseff. I have a feeling they had sympathy for Brazil. There was even, because we have this saying in Brazil that God is Brazilian. And he was saying the Pope is Argentinian, but God is Brazilian. He did say that.
That is quite a statement. Pope Francis will certainly be remembered in Brazil, as he will in all over the world. Fernando Augusto Pacheco, thank you very much for joining us. And now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. China is warning countries not to make trade deals with the U.S. that could hurt Beijing's interests. The warning comes as several nations try to avoid tariffs announced by U.S. President Donald Trump, which are on hold until July. Russia has launched missiles and drones at Ukraine just hours after a short-lived Easter ceasefire ended. Both countries blame each other for breaking the 30-hour truce, which ended Sunday with no plans to continue it. And South Korea's former President Yoon Suk-yeol has appeared in court for the second hearing in his insurrection trial. Cameras were allowed this time, unlike the first hearing earlier this month. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Laura. Now, with the United States under the Trump administration remaking its relationships with both China and Russia in the past few months, the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. has run a new survey looking at how American attitudes to these two countries have changed. I spoke with Pew researchers Moira Fagan and Christine Huang about the two surveys, and I started by asking Christine about the view of Americans on trade and tariffs with China.
Americans, when looking at the trade relationship between the US and China, see a somewhat unbalanced relationship. So when asked who benefits more from trade between the two countries, is it the US? Is it China? Do they benefit both equally, or do neither of them benefit? They tend to say that China benefits more than the US. And so this is largely unchanged from the last time we asked this question, but is still a substantial share. And so on the heels of that, we also asked whether people will think that the tariffs on China will be good or bad for either themselves or the US as a country. And so for the most part, people think that tariffs will have a negative effect on the country and also on themselves personally. So about half say that the tariffs will have a bad effect on those two issues. So it's interesting because there is a substantial partisan split on this measure. And so Republicans are far less likely than Democrats to say that the tariffs will be bad for the country or for themselves.
And Moira, to look at one of the other big issues in the news at the moment, that is the war between Ukraine and Russia. And I think, frankly, anyone who remembers the Cold War would be surprised that it is Republicans who currently view Russia less as an enemy and more as a competitor. Tell us about that kind of evolution in the survey.
Right. And so I just want to also note that this survey comes from interviews with over 3,000 U.S. adults, and it was fielded at the end of March. So prior to sort of more recent developments on this issue this past week, such as Secretary Rubio's comments on U.S. involvement in the peace talks. But just sort of key takeaways are that while Americans still have very negative views of both Russia and Putin, there is some waning support for U.S. involvement in the war between Russia and Ukraine. And as you noted, Americans overall are slightly less likely to see Russia as an enemy as opposed to a competitor or partner. And this especially is the case among Republicans, where Republicans have dropped down to 40% who say Russia's an enemy and 45% see Russia as a competitor. And that's the first time since before the war began that we've seen more Republicans call Russia a competitor than an enemy. And for their part, Democratic opinion is somewhat generally unchanged. It has not changed as much. Democrats are still much more likely to call Russia an enemy of the US than anything else, though that has declined somewhat in recent months.
Christine, that enemy versus competitor tag is interesting across both of these surveys because in the case of China, it does seem like neither party sees, at least a majority in neither party sees China as an enemy. They do see China more as a competitor, even though, well, frankly, members in both parties will talk sometimes more of China being an enemy. You've seen a mild softening of views towards China, haven't you?
Absolutely. So we've looked at views of China among Americans in several ways. And so one of the main questions we ask is, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view? And for the first time in a couple of years, we've seen a slight decrease in the share of Americans with an unfavorable view. And the intensity of the sentiment has especially decreased. In last year, when we asked this question, 43% of Americans said they had a very unfavorable view of China. And that's only 33% today. So a drop of 10 percentage points. And we also asked, as we did with Russia, whether Americans see China as an enemy, a partner, or a competitor. And as you noted, most Americans say that China is a competitor and not an enemy. And the share of people who thought China was an enemy was the highest recorded last year, and we're down from that as well. And so most people consider China a competitor. And it's interesting because in terms of China, it's also Republicans who have softened a little bit more than Democrats have in looking at China as an enemy. And so there's been a drop of 14 percentage points among Republicans who say that China is an enemy. And for Democrats, they have also dropped in the share who consider China an enemy. But they're also a little bit more likely than they were before to consider China a partner, though the share of Democrats who hold this opinion is still very small in comparison to Democrats who hold other opinions.
And Maura, when you spoke of some of the partisan divides in perceptions of Russia, I think the most interesting one for me in this survey was on what Americans believe comes next, because you found this incredibly growing gulf between the parties on whether they're concerned about Russia invading other countries beyond Ukraine. Tell us about that.
Yes, so we asked about two possible outcomes of the war. The first is Russia invading other countries in the region, not just Ukraine, and the other was Ukraine being defeated and taken over by Russia. The question asked, how concerned were you about either of these two possible outcomes? And overall, we found about half of Americans are concerned about Russia invading other countries, and 43% are concerned about Ukraine being defeated. But it is, as you note, the partisan divide on this question is quite wide. There are almost 40 percentage points on both possible outcomes between Democrats who are more concerned than Republicans who are less concerned. And it's really striking to see the movement of that over time. When we asked this question in the first months of the war in 2022, there were some modest partisan differences, but still Republicans and Democrats were much closer together than they are now. They have drifted farther apart in the several times we've asked this question over the years.
And Christine, somewhat similar question to you, but is there a concern, or how would you identify the concern in the polling that whether China sort of poses any kind of direct threat to the United States or a threat beyond its own nation, as it were, something that the U.S. needs to focus on in terms of a regional concern, as much as politicians have been saying?
Sure. So this year, we were able to ask Americans to name a country that they consider to be the greatest threat to the U.S. And so Americans, we found, were most likely to name China as that country. So 42% of Americans think that China is the country posing the greatest threat to the U.S. So this is slightly down from 2 years ago when half of Americans held this opinion. And actually, the share who considered Russia the greatest threat has risen a little bit. And so we've also found in the past that Americans are somewhat concerned about China's territorial disputes with neighboring countries. And so there is a sense that China poses a geopolitical risk to the U.S. And so we also find that Americans think that the tensions between China and Taiwan are at least somewhat important to the U.S. national interests as well.
And Christine, just to follow up, because one other interesting party divide that I spotted in the survey on China was simply on China's strength, whether it is a growing or a faltering economic power, whether it is a growing or faltering military power.
So we have asked before and now which country is the world's top military power and which country is the world's top economic power. And so we find in this case that America is most likely to be named as the top economic power and as the top military power. But there have been some notable partisan shifts on those measures. And so before in the past, we found that Republicans were more likely to name China as the top economic power and also somewhat more likely to name China as the top military power than Democrats were. But they've actually flip-flopped on that a little bit. And so now Democrats are more likely to name China as the top economic power and also as the top military power.
That was Moira Fagan and Christine Huang speaking to me earlier from the Pew Research Center. This is The Briefing. And finally on today's show, it is time for a roundup of news from the Nordics. And for that, we are joined right here in the studio by Monocle's Gunnar Grunlid. And Gunnar, it is perhaps strange that we're going from Fernando and sort of the most Catholic region of the world to the least Catholic region of the world. How have the Nordics been reacting to news of Pope Francis' passing?
Well, just like you said, the Nordics are among the least Catholic countries in the world. And yet, if you look at all the major Nordic newspapers at the moment, there is nothing but Pope Francis there on the front page. I mean, I'm seeing 5 to 10 stories about Pope Francis on almost every single newspaper. Pope Francis was deeply, deeply beloved in Scandinavia, despite the fact that we are overwhelmingly Protestant. But he was actually one of the few popes to even visit Scandinavia. He didn't come to my home country of Norway, but he did go to Sweden in 2016, which was actually for the 499th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation Day. So he showed a lot of these kind of acts of unity, I think, with the rest of the Christian community around the world. And of course, the Nordics are also very secular, but we all loved him despite of that because of he shared, I think, the Nordics' values in many ways, the very liberal values, tolerance, women's rights, LGBTQ rights. And so he was someone who we looked up to as a world leader. He wasn't just he was a Christian leader for the Protestants, and he was a world leader, I think, just morally speaking. So he'll be deeply missed and very hard to replace, I think.
It is very interesting how he reached out to non-Catholics, other Christians, and also, as we've heard earlier in the show, reached out to Islamic leaders and others as well. But Gunnar, in some other news that we wanted to focus on for you, Norway's Prime Minister is visiting Washington, D.C. this week, and he's bringing a known quantity in Jens Stoltenberg with him. I suppose this is just to give him a bit of extra heft.
Yes, I mean, Norway's joining the train of world leaders who are making their visits to the White House one by one to try to deal with this whole tariff situation. Now, the big move that our Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre has made, which he prepared a few months ago, as we spoke about, I believe, here and on the Monocle Daily, he basically kicked out his entire coalition Centre Party in order that he could make it an entire Labour Party. And the main reason for that, most pundits agree, was to get Jens Stoltenberg back. He was our beloved former Prime Minister. Many agree that he was his reign was the best Norway has ever been. Then he went to be the NATO chief, and he was chief of NATO between 2014 and 2024. In that time, he was called by Politico the Trump whisperer. He was very good at managing Trump during that whole time, and he's very good economically, and he's very good on defense. And so Stoltenberg is really the star of this visit, not actually our prime minister. And if we have a shot at sort of managing this relationship with the US, then Stoltenberg is probably the one who's going to manage it. The really tricky balance that they're going to have to figure out here is because Norway's not a part of the European Union, but we are in the European, the deal with the EU, so we still work very closely with them. Finding that balance between having this very strong bilateral relationship with the US and not getting squeezed between the US and the EU is going to be very tricky. But we all have a lot of faith in Stoltenberg, so we're hoping it's going to work out.
And on the defense front, Jens Stoltenberg will have news to present perhaps to Donald Trump, even if he is not currently the defense minister. He is the finance minister. But the Nordics are forming their own sort of unified pan-Nordic army.
Yeah, and this of course has been going on for a while, I would say particularly since Sweden and Finland joined NATO in 2023, but it's really starting to come together. I think in particular now with Denmark freaking out about the US wanting to get Greenland, everyone sort of lost faith in being able to trust that the US will have NATO, Europe, and indeed the Nordics back in any sort of defense sense. And so the Nordic countries are really forming a really strong alliance now, particularly the four main countries, sort of excluding Iceland, because Iceland is not very militarized. But Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland are very much unifying their militaries now so that they have a chance to stand against Russia. And of course, because we share a land border with Finland and Norway share a land border with Russia, I think we're taking the threat of Russia a lot more seriously. Our intelligence services have been very publicly stating that we believe Russia will attack Europe and trigger Article 5 of NATO in the next 5 years before 2030. That's sort of the strong agreement in the Nordic intelligence services, and they're being very public about that. And sort of the benefit that we have there is that actually the different capabilities are very well balanced. So Finland, which is of course sort of our frontier with Russia, they are the best at mobilization. They are ready to mobilize about 900,000 reservists within a week if they need to. They have huge troop numbers. Sweden is amazing at tanks, and they're growing really quickly to become a leader with anti-drone technology. Norway has long been a sort of world leader in missiles, and Denmark and satellite infrastructure as well, where we actually have a strong collaboration with the US. And Denmark's special forces are sort of known as world-class around the world. Denmark actually are going to be sending unarmed troops to Ukraine soon, to the western side of Ukraine, which of course Russia's responded to quite aggressively and said that those Danish troops will be legitimate targets. But basically what we're seeing here is that because NATO is wobbling at the moment, we're seeing these sort of smaller regional collaborations on defense, and the Nordic model looks very, very strong, and a lot of people are commenting that this is actually what a lot of Europe should try to do. So for example, around the Balkan nations should maybe try something similar, other parts of Europe should try something similar, but just the speed, the rapidity, and sort of how unified the Nordics are right now on defense could be a potential model for us to sort of survive this whole uncertainty, a situation that's going on at the moment.
Gunnar, just finally, quickly, before we let you go, I know Norway has been facing growing tourism, which is never necessarily a bad thing, a coolcation trend, and nonetheless they want to introduce a tourist tax to tamp down on some of this.
Yeah, and this is very much true across all of the Nordics. Many travel companies have been seeing double booking figures across the Nordics in recent years as part of this whole coolcation trend. People want to escape the heat and also escape, I think, kind of the increasingly unwanted tourism vibe that we're getting in a lot of other parts of Europe, where they're very aggressively sort of, we do not want more of you over here. So the Nordic countries have sort of grown in response to all of that. But that does mean that we are now finally starting to see that kind of local backlash a little bit. So people are sort of calling for, we need to do something to sort of cull these numbers or make it more manageable. And so our trade and industry minister has proposed a 3% tourism tax on all tourists. It'll basically apply to overnight stays, Airbnbs, hotels, campsites, and the like. And you know, Norwegians love putting taxes on things. So it's the kind of thing that, you know, we're usually quite welcoming of. But there is actually a lot of criticism of saying that, you know, just now that our tourism sector is starting to grow a lot, and it's in this economically uncertain period where we need what we can get sort of thing, to sort of make this very public at the moment. It is being reported sort of in global media, and to sort of announce to the world that we aren't as welcoming of you as we might be. A lot of people are sort of criticizing that as well. So it's not certain yet if we are going to go down this route. So we'll see what happens.
Must be said, Norway is also not the cheapest country in the
It already
world,
isn't the cheapest. It is very expensive. So, yeah.
Gunnar Grodlid of Monocle, thank you very much for joining us. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Tom Webb. Our researcher was Gunnar Grodlid, and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Cermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.